Hey, Retcon Raider here, and welcome back to the increasingly elusive Retcon Retrospective. For those of you just joining us within the past 18 months, I guess, this actually used to be a semi-regular series where I would just touch base with the viewers, look back on the last few months, ramble into an open mic about numbers and games, and just, chat about whatever else came to mind. Oh, and plug the Patreons and the PayPals and whatnot, I guess. I've never really enjoyed doing that, but it is an important part of the format, especially these days. But it's kind of hard to believe I used to actually do this monthly. Then again, I suppose that was also back when YouTube was shiny and new. The heady days of 2015, back when no one really knew what to make of content creators, and even a small and incredibly niche channel like mine could get a halfway decent foothold, to the point where game dev companies inexplicably took me seriously. They have certainly learned their lesson since then, with a few rare exceptions. Owlcat's not tired of me just yet. That said, things have definitely gotten a good bit less exciting since then. A good bit more routine, especially with people just, I think, getting more used to the whole concept of what I guess we now collectively categorize as online influencers. I still prefer content creators myself. I'm not really trying to influence anyone, but I definitely create content. It's a very broad term. But yes, for better or worse, a lot of the early excitement and uncertainty that I used to talk about is just no longer a thing. I mean, the channel numbers have mostly gelled and stabilized over the past few years. We don't really tend to see the huge, unpredictable highs or lows that we did in those early years, and thankfully, though YouTube does still make things difficult from time to time with their ever-shifting sea of rules and restrictions, they've actually done a halfway decent job of also preventing the more disruptive trends from just constantly taking hold. I mean, yeah, it's easy to wax nostalgic about the good old days when I'd wake up and find the algorithm had randomly blessed me with 100,000 views overnight. But that attention also often tended to come with just a big old pile of headaches or drama. For every Phoenix Point or Pathfinder, there was yet another adpocalypse or some ceaseless, overwhelming hate campaign about what often boiled down to some mundane element of the industry. And I mean, look, that's not to say that someone is wrong to get bent out of shape over any one particular thing. Platform exclusivity, de novo, cut content, buggy launches. Sure, those are aggravating, but it's just that those hate campaigns tended to be wildly disproportionate and incredibly indiscriminate. It often felt like most people pushing them were really just in it to get attention or to provoke reactions, as opposed to, actually fighting for whatever it was that they were ostensibly mad about. That aside, even taking the legitimately genuine, deserved drama into account, it's really just not what I've ever been here to focus on. I get more than enough drama in my day-to-day life. I really don't need more when I'm just trying to unwind. From day one, I was always here, really, just to lean into the escapism of it all, which I've always seen as the main intent of the entertainment media industry in the first place. I mean, obviously it's not. The main intent of entertainment media is to make giant piles of money for corporate executives, just like every other aspect of our micro-monetized lives, but if I get caught up on that, then I'll just never be able to enjoy anything ever again. So I just, pretend not to notice. Slap on those blinders and try to enjoy the product, not the process that surrounds making it. That said, for me, it's always been about the escapism of it all. And I like to imagine that's carried over into the sort of content that I generally tend to create. Games where I can draft viewers into various certain death scenarios, and we all have fun sort of building a narrative around their day-to-day life and death struggles, while simultaneously exploring whatever the game has to offer. Or alternatively, getting elbows deep into games with predefined characters and intricate, tightly woven plots that we can piece together, or just that happen to have surreal settings that are fascinating to explore. I like to get lost in those worlds, either by following the various threads of those narratives or by bucking them and creating my own, and in doing so, I like to imagine that it likewise gives the viewers a brief reprieve from the relentless rigors of the real. Which, I suppose, is really all kind of a roundabout, rambling way to delve into the real topic I'm trying to broach here. Which is, what happened to the Retcon Retrospectives? And hey, that's a great question, random viewer. I was just getting to that, and it's very rude of you to interrupt. Please don't do that. But hey, it is a valid question. I suppose it is the metaphorical mastodon in the room, given that as of the moment I'm recording this, it's been like 16 months since the last one. It is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, but, actually talked about very little. Because, honestly, it's all just kind of too real and depressing. And as I just so circuitously laid out, my whole thing here has always kind of been to avoid those things that are too depressing and or real. But yeah, just to put it out there, hopefully to touch on it without getting too into my own head about it. Haha. My mother passed away back in late 2022, which I'm still sad about, but I mean, in retrospect, I suppose it was also a long time coming. She had had health scares in the past, in the years and decades prior, cancer in particular, with increasingly aggressive treatment regimens to help keep them at bay, so I suppose I really shouldn't have been surprised when she finally revealed that it had all come back, and that this time she'd opted not to seek treatment. Not only that, but she'd also deliberately waited to tell us, her extended family, until it was really kind of too late to do anything about it at all. It wasn't just that she was tired of being poked and prodded, though that was also definitely a big part of it, but also that she just didn't want to become an ongoing burden to the rest of the family. My father had passed away from a cascading series of health crises 20, 30-odd years ago, and left a giant mountain of medical debt in his wake that had taken us years to really resolve. That was a big part of why I spent so long in customer service, working 40, 50, 60-hour work weeks, to try to help dig us out of that hole. And it wasn't something my mother wanted us to have to ever go through again. Which I do appreciate. But at the time, I was still upset. I was distraught. There was an accelerated cycle of the 7 stages running the gamut from, anger all the way to acceptance. Just abruptly, mercifully cut short when she let go. I think 2 weeks after the reveal. But in the midst of all that, there was a period where it bled over into the channel, when me and my extended family were desperately trying to find a way to work out the financials back out in the real, to find some way to make it all work without losing her in the process. But, that was also post-pandemic, at the onset of any number of increasingly awful economic situations, which is why, despite really, honestly, not wanting to do it, I made a video asking the viewers for help. It really went against everything that I am, or that I wanted the channel to be, but I was desperate and discombobulated, and so at the goading of some of my good friends, I made a video touching on the whole situation and asking for help with it. And I mean, the Raiders, the rank-and-file viewers, they all rallied. They were incredibly generous, and I can't even begin to say how thankful I was and still am that they helped ease the start of what ended up becoming a year-long slow-boil nightmare of dealing with debtors and lawyers and the general sort of soulless vultures that tend to flock around any estate unfortunate enough to get tangled up in an extended probate. But then, as the smoke finally started to clear and some semblance of normalcy started to settle back in, so too did the inevitable guilt, self-loathing at the thought that I had exploited a crisis, that I had emotionally manipulated my audience into sending me that extra support. Especially in an era where, let's be honest, most people are probably facing some similar flavor of financial or existential struggle themselves. Was I justified in asking for help during a time of crisis? I don't know, maybe. I honestly try not to spend too much time dwelling on it because that does very much put me in an unhealthy headspace. But in the aftermath, it did leave me feeling like I had violated the central conceit, the central pillar of what the channel was originally supposed to be built around, which is escapism. Brief windows into these other fantastical worlds where you could just stop worrying about the real one, if even just for a little while. And, to that end, I kept cranking out content. Honestly, given the extended probate, I really couldn't afford not to. But I leaned hard into the story-driven stuff that was a lot easier to lose myself in. The various Pathfinders, the early builds for Rogue Trader, a disappointingly brief return to Scarlet Hollow, which I'm very much looking forward to returning to later this year, if and when that new chapter ever comes out. But in retrospect, I can definitely see that I simultaneously backed away from the tactical titles where I would get attached to the various Raider or viewer-submitted characters that I was then tasked with keeping healthy and alive. Something which I think did ultimately sort of come to a head with Wildermyth, a game that I normally very much enjoy, but one where the inescapable grasp of death, the ever-present looming sense of existential dread, is very, very much a core concept. Hence the rather abrupt pause on our current campaign in progress, which I do also intend to return to at some point. But so too were the retrospectives a casualty of that tumultuous time. The period of perpetual probate where it was basically impossible to move on from my mother's passing because of the ongoing legal and financial issues that were left festooned in her wake. Working on videos became a welcome reprieve, a time I could just stop thinking about whatever other wearisome task I would otherwise have to focus on. Sorting through the artifacts she had collected in her 70-odd years of life, dismantling my childhood home, dealing with the vultures circling the estate, wondering whether there were things I could have done to somehow magically avoid or at least mitigate how everything had ultimately played out. But yeah, given that these retrospectives were often a good place to just sort of touch base and share some real talk about what's going on in my life outside of these fictional universes we usually focus on, it was borderline impossible for me to work on one without falling back into that slow dread spiral of depressing real talk. Something which I'm actually doing right now. This intro segment was supposed to be like 3 minutes long. But this is just how my brain works when I start rambling. And it's something I recognized every time I started working on a new retro, which would ultimately lead me to shelve it. And then, on top of that, it was even more problematic because the last time I'd really gotten stuck into talking about all this stuff was in that now delisted video where I essentially pleaded for the viewers to come to my aid, which in turn made me feel like I was doing it all over again every time I brought it up afterwards. So yeah, incredibly long story short, my innate propensity and preference for escapism was supercharged for much of last year, with the unfortunate side effect being an aversion to certain types of content. The retrospectives, definitely among them. But all that said, things have definitely improved these past 6 or 12 months. I moved late last year to somewhere new, near what's left of my ever-shrinking family, and while things haven't exactly worked out the way I intended, I mean, seriously, the housing market is just completely fucked right now. Just getting distance from the place I grew up in made it a lot easier to stop dwelling on all the ifs, buts, and could-have-beens. Likewise, as of a few weeks ago, the probate has finally trundled to an ignominious end. The damn thing stole 16 months of my life, and honestly makes me wonder how anyone is ever supposed to have time to actually grieve or recover when there are so many industries built around the exploitation of personal tragedy. But I digress. I've only just escaped that venomous snake pit, and I'm not eager to throw myself back into it. I did, however, want to acknowledge it in passing, one last look back at it as it fades away in our rearview mirror, hopefully never to be seen again. I do think it's important to reflect and learn from events, both good and bad, because how else are you supposed to convert them into experience points and continue gaining levels? Hence, of course, this retrospective. Or at least the long and meandering real talk portion of it, which is now mercifully coming to an end. I just thought it was important to once again resume the long-standing tradition of touching base with you, my viewers, so you can see where my head is at and why I'm doing the various things that I'm doing, even when they're obviously not the most practical. It's some much-needed transparency and a hopeful return to normalcy. And with that, we move on. The world is still a mishmash nightmare of noise and nonsense, nowadays more than ever. So we turn our eye back towards more fictional and fantastical things. Though I suppose we should at least very briefly touch on the numbers. And honestly, as alluded to earlier, YouTube is kind of in a weird place these days. But it is stable. Now, I'm not really the best person to talk about this stuff, but based on my understanding, suffice to say, YouTube saw an unprecedented surge of new creators during the lockdowns, for pretty obvious reasons, while simultaneously seeing a similar surge in new viewers who were just voraciously consuming all that new content to fill the void left by the absence of other things. So too did those years see the rise of a glut of other digitally focused markets, gaming platforms, streaming services, remote shopping, and so on. But, inevitably, the lockdowns lifted, and it has led to a number of drastic shifts in the digital landscape, as things have at least gotten back towards some semblance of normalcy. There was suddenly an oversaturation of all these new digital markets and content creators who no longer had a literal captive audience to help keep them all afloat. I mean, obviously, there's a whole fascinating conversation to be had there, but again, I'm not really the best person to talk about it. So instead, I'll just say, as a modestly sized content creator myself, especially in the already oversaturated gaming category, things have been weird. YouTube embraced the chaos early on, but in more recent years, they have definitely been trying to pull back to more carefully curate their offerings, but while also simultaneously expanding into new and often utterly incompatible markets like YouTube Shorts, YouTube streaming, YouTube podcasts, which play to completely different algorithms and audiences than the ones they already have in place for long-format content like mine. For my part, I will say I was blessed in having already carved out my own little niche pre-pandemic, which gave me a much-needed foothold to avoid being washed away by the sea of changes that came in the subsequent months and years afterwards. I survived that ocean of change, which is more than I can say for many other content creators, some of whom I had known and looked up to in the early years when I was first getting my own channel established. As things have stabilized, though, it is clear that with the advent of these changes and my own innate resistance to change, and, a million other new complicating factors, I have been pushed squarely into the shallower end of the pool. I'm still monetized, my numbers are stable, but they're also a mite bit lower than they used to be. Gone are the days of just randomly hitting tens or hundreds of thousands of views on a seemingly random video, at least with how I do things. These days I consider myself lucky if we can hit 5,000 views on an upload, let alone 5 digits. This is something that I've been a lot more acutely aware of this year, due to recent inexplicable dips in the first and second quarter of 2024. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm well aware that all long-running series do tend to start struggling with audience retention as those episode numbers climb. But this was something broader. The drops are more uniform across all 3 of our ongoing series both times. That's generally more indicative of some change on the back end as opposed to viewers rebelling against any particular series. It's an annoyance on a series like Rogue Trader, which, despite being down from its previous average of about 2,000 views per episode, still has robust enough numbers to be considered sustainable, if, just barely. But it's a lot trickier when it comes to the less successful titles. Jagged Alliance 3, for example, dropped from about 1,500 views per to just below the 1,000 view threshold. But we were so close to the end of the campaign that I just powered through, and of course I'm glad I did. I like finishing projects. Unfortunately, though, that's not really something I can do with a game like Baldur's Gate 3, because we're apparently nowhere near the end. Honestly, I've been genuinely shocked at how long even just the first act of the game has been. We are seriously at the 50-hour mark, and we've apparently still just barely even scratched the surface. I've got viewers telling me entirely straight-faced that we're almost out of the tutorial area, which is insane to me. The tutorial should not be 50 hours long. But that aside, it's also a series that, again, unfortunately, was already kind of struggling to begin with, even before this latest dip in the analytics. It was barely treading water on sustainability back in Q1, and it's only kind of gotten worse since then, which is a shame because it is also a game that really has kind of grown on me. I had some early concerns and misgivings, especially back during early access, but the more I've played it, the more I've genuinely come to enjoy it, especially where the exploration and intricately woven lore are concerned. I do nitpick at the cracks where I see them. I mean, it's hard to ignore how bad certain things like Halcyon and Will's hastily rewritten backgrounds mesh in the otherwise neatly woven narrative. But that's just because I'm so thoroughly invested in a lot of the other stuff that surrounds it. It makes the stuff that doesn't quite fit all that much more noticeable. I also just really appreciate that despite being fewer in number, the audience for that particular series seems just as invested as I am, in some cases even more so. I've always enjoyed reading through viewer comments, and Baldur's Gate 3 tends to pull in an average of twice as many comments per episode as Rogue Trader, and up to 5 times as many as Jagged Alliance 3. It also tends to perform better on select engagement metrics, audience view retention, per episode click-throughs, which, again, really reinforces that it maintains a smaller but more engaged and passionate audience. Unfortunately, despite that passion and my own enjoyment of the series, I do see it inexorably sliding down into Wildermyth territory in the analytics. That's another game that I very much enjoy playing, at least under normal circumstances, and one that also tends to maintain a small but very passionate audience. But it is likewise a series that has long struggled when it comes to sustainability. I mean, granted, there are some very different factors at play here. Wildermyth, for as much as I love it, is a very niche game with a very limited mainstream appeal. The art style alone is often cited by folks as why they won't even give it a chance. Baldur's Gate 3, on the other hand, is a game with too much mainstream appeal. Even now, months after the game's launch, there are dozens, if not hundreds of other content creators just cranking out content for it left and right. directly competing with other creators has never been my strong point. And even more so when it comes to games with this sort of meme or shenanigan potential. I'm not a bombastic or spontaneous sort of personality. I'm very much an introspective introvert who loves to get fully immersed in a setting and sort of slow boil progression as I explore and analyze everything it has to offer. But obviously, that is an issue when it comes to a long and sprawling game like this one. Just to put it bluntly, Wrath was getting roughly 50% more engagement per episode than Baldur's Gate 3 is. And with Wrath recently retaking the lead in the polls, that does make me wonder why I'm not just returning to Pathfinder. Honestly, it's something that's really kind of been highlighted recently with our abrupt dip back into Xenonauts 2. I mentioned it in a couple of my more recent videos, but that wasn't planned. Xenonauts 2 was an emergency substitute after our planned return to Lord of Nothing went awry. It turned out we had paused the series right before I had triggered a bug that completely hardlocked our progress. But despite it very clearly being a last-minute rushed substitute, Xenonauts 2 was actually met with a surprising amount of enthusiasm from a lot of my regular viewers. It's very much a niche game, but I think closer to the sort of games that tend to have an easier time gaining traction in my particular corner of the internet. It's a smaller, lower-budget indie title that you don't have a glut of creators all tripping over each other to mine for content. Honestly, even bigger games like Rogue Trader and Jagged Alliance 3 are still very much niche titles compared to something with a big budget and mainstream appeal like Baldur's Gate 3. That aside, I'm sure it also helped that it was the first new project I've started in quite some time. I mean, while I do talk about the long-term sustainability of various series, there's no denying that my strongest numbers generally do tend to come from the first few episodes of any new project. I have no idea where Xenonauts 2 will stabilize, but thus far, the first 2 episodes have gotten better numbers than anything else I've uploaded in Q2. The only even remotely comparable numbers I can put up against it from any time recently are from November of last year, coinciding with the launch of 2 other new series, Lord of Nothing and Jagged Alliance 3. Which, really does sort of bring us back to something I've talked about in the past retrospectives in particular, which is that YouTube, despite ostensibly encouraging creators to work on long-form, bingeable, serialized content, is also really kind of set up to simultaneously discourage it. It's a lot easier to entice a casual viewer into checking out a brand new series than it is to lure them into something that's already 50-plus episodes deep. It's why so many other gaming channels take the variety gamer format, as opposed to letting themselves get bogged down in just 1 or 2 long-running series, unless, of course, their entire channel is built around one particular game or franchise, which is certainly a workable approach. I mean, I could just become the Owlcat channel or something, but it's also one that does come with its own tangled mess of hazards and pitfalls. With all that in mind, as I've said many times before, I also just don't like the idea of up and abandoning a project, or even pausing it, not unless it's for a particularly good reason, such as, recurring copyright or objectionable content issues. Or, I suppose, if it just ends up being a game I legitimately was not enjoying, which is rare, but it does very occasionally happen. I won't name any names. However, when a series really does start seriously underperforming, that's when I have to start making some tougher decisions. There's a lot to be said for playing a game I enjoy, Baldur's Gate 3 and Wildermyth very much included. But if a series consistently shows that it is ultimately unsustainable, especially if it's a longer series like Baldur's Gate 3, then there does have to be a point where I take a step back and seriously reconsider which projects I should be prioritizing. And unfortunately, I do think that is the point we're hitting with Baldur's Gate 3. I mean, I'm not ready to write it off just yet, but unless it suddenly sees a big spike in sustainability, whether through drastically increased engagement on YouTube or more direct support via Patreon or YouTube memberships, it is going to ultimately have to be marginalized for the good of the channel. I do plan on keeping it going in the short term, but likely in a tertiary off slot with 1 episode a week instead of 2. Like I said, it's a series I enjoy playing, but I basically can't justify giving it more than 1 slot a week, at least not under the current circumstances. And honestly, even that's kind of pushing it, given the comparatively much greater success we're seeing with a game like Xenonauts 2. In fact, the success we're seeing with Xenonauts 2 has encouraged me to start spending a little more time focusing on shorter projects or one-offs. There are a lot of games that have caught my eye over the past year that have ultimately ended up falling by the wayside, so I could keep focusing on these bigger, longer-running projects. And at this point, it's very evident that that's been to the detriment of the overall channel. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't want to completely avoid long-running projects either. I very much enjoy Wrath and Rogue Trader, and both projects have shown that they can maintain at least some degree of long-term sustainability. I also find it very gratifying to finish a long-running project. I love that we actually finished Jagged Alliance 3, despite it running a solid 20 or 30 episodes longer than I originally anticipated. I think my main takeaway from looking over the analytics for the past year and a half is that while it is okay to have 1 or maybe even 2 such series running side by side, it really shouldn't be the only thing that we're running. We need something new to help change things up every once in a while, even if it is just a glorified one-shot to act as a palate cleanser between or amidst the other longer-running projects. With Jagged Alliance 3 having just recently come to an end, I was already thinking about focusing the freed-up slot on reintroducing and hopefully finishing some of our shorter, paused projects. Lord of Nothing was obviously near the top of that list. It's like 12, 15 hours long. We were already 4 hours into it. Varnhold's Lot, too, since we were literally just a few episodes from finishing it, back when I originally paused it, like we were outside the final dungeon. I'm honestly not sure why I stopped it where I did. But really, any shorter project is ideal for what I have in mind. Slay the Princess, the new chapter of Scarlet Hollow, Dreams in the Witch House, Space Wreck, Shadowrun Returns, even my beloved Wildermyth. These are all projects that could theoretically start and finish in a matter of weeks, rather than months or years. We could even get a few mid-length projects in the mix. Stygian, that's a 20-hour game I'd love to revisit. Pentiment and Hard West 2 reportedly run about 25. The Thaumaturge, Palace of Ice, Phoenix Point, Shadowrun Dragonfall, and Hong Kong, they're all about 30 hours long. Those are all games that I would love to revisit, and they're all potential projects that are very inherently finishable in the span of just 2 or 3 months, even running side by side with other series, versus, the 100 plus hour CRPGs that have inadvertently become our mainstay. I guess what I'm ultimately kind of saying is that while I definitely want to still keep at least 1 or 2 long-running series running, Rogue Trader and Wrath are both pretty good prospects there, I also want to make sure that for every one of those, we've also got something else, something shorter and sweeter to offset it with. Something to cleanse our palate or change our pace on a monthly or bi-monthly basis that, even if they end up being something that any individual viewer might not happen to enjoy, they at least know it's going to get finished or otherwise cycled out in a matter of weeks, rather than a matter of years. On a similar note, I really do want to spend more time, at least sporadically peeking in on brand new titles as well. There are just so many games that I'd love to at least touch on, ones that might not be great for a full-blown series, but have at least piqued my interest enough that I'd like a chance to share them, to ever so briefly explore them, if just to let the raiders know that they exist. I still do manage to pop one out every so often, most recently with the Thaumaturge demo a few months back. But I'd really like to make that a slightly more regular occurrence. Both to give those little oddball games more exposure, but also, again, as an occasional change of pace to help juice the numbers with more accessible one-shots for newer viewers, and of course to also get a better idea of how viable they might be if I do end up considering a longer-running series later down the line. Regardless, though, you get the idea. I've kind of spiraled here a bit, but the general gist is that I like the long-running series, but we do need to shake things up a bit to keep this all sustainable. I do want to keep some of our more enduring projects going, but I also want to find more time for smaller and newer projects as well. Things we can actually finish or cycle through on a slightly more regular basis. We're fortunate in that Jagged Alliance 3 ended before sustainability really became a serious issue. But the harsh reality is that Baldur's Gate 3 just isn't as lucky. I am still weighing my options there. I'm not pulling the plug just yet. But I do think it's important to make clear where it currently stands. Anyway, that all got a little bleaker than I'd like, so let's see if we can maybe offset all that gloom and doom with something a little more hopeful and new. It has been quite a while, so how about we dust off the old Retcon Radar? See what new titles have recently piqued my interest. I mean, obviously this isn't a comprehensive list. The full series of watch lists I maintain are like 300 games strong at this point, ranging from titles I'm sincerely looking forward to, all the way down to games that I'm really only following out of morbid curiosity. But these, however, the carefully curated lists I'm currently holding, these are all new titles, either brand new releases or prospective projects still coming down the pipeline, with a distinct focus on more obscure indies that you might not have otherwise heard of. So, with that in mind, let's dig in. Alright, so first on the list is Dead Season by Snailbite and Iceberg Interactive. It's a character-driven turn-based tactical game set during a modern-era zombie outbreak, with the player taking control of a group of desperate survivors as they try to navigate the undead apocalypse. I don't really talk about it a lot, but I am a huge fan of unconventional turn-based tactical games, and I've always been particularly taken by the idea of turn-based horror games. I mean, I would play the crap out of a turn-based Resident Evil or Silent Hill game. It's a big part of why I was so excited to support Phoenix Point back in the day. Granted, in this case, it's a bit of a tamer setting. Modern-era zombie survival a la The Walking Dead. But from what I've seen in concept art and trailers, it does look like it's very well done. The gameplay is a mix of stealth, combat, and survival, with a solid turn-based twist. It's definitely intended to be a shorter game, 16 handcrafted scenarios at launch, narratively linked with comic-style cutscenes. And while I do personally prefer more open-ended or open-world campaigns, there is a lot to be said for well-made, handcrafted maps and scenarios, especially when they can help drive the narrative forward while also mixing up the gameplay to help keep things from getting too stale or repetitive. Always a very prominent risk with this particular subgenre. That aside, I'll also highlight that I do have a certain degree of trust in the developers and publishers behind this particular title, since they're the same ones who previously did Strange Horticulture, another shorter but very fun little title that I have previously played. In fact, while I am excited to check out Dead Season, which is actually getting its first playable demo in just a few days, I'm actually even more excited by a separate announcement they recently made about a quirky little game called Strange Antiquities. That is the sequel to Strange Horticulture, a return to the eerie environs of Undermere to trade in untrustworthy trinkets. Also, there's a cat. So hey, this blip on the Retcon Radar is actually a twofer, because both of those games are definitely going on my list of potential projects. Who knows? Maybe I'll even do a quick one-shot on that demo when it drops next week. And speaking of strange little indie games, the next one on my list is an odd little number named Esoteric Ebb by Christopher Beauregard and Sudden Snail. No relation to Snailbite, I assume, though I suppose I could certainly see how one might ultimately lead to the other. This is actually one I've wanted to talk about for a while now, because it is a bizarre mix of D&D and Disco Elysium, and I don't say that lightly. It's definitely one of those games where it almost feels like it might skirt too close to the original inspiration from time to time, but still somehow manages to very distinctly maintain its own identity. At its core, it's essentially a dialogue-driven point-and-click adventure game, which uses a very, very abstract version of the 5th edition D&D rule set. The player takes on the role of a nameless and socially inept cleric who wakes up on a slab after a near-death experience, and then has to piece together who they are, how they ended up on a slab, and who's behind the crime, or crimes plural, that they were originally sent to investigate, all while simultaneously navigating the perilous political landscape and the simmering cross-species tensions of a city on the brink of open conflict. There is actually a demo available for this one, which I wholeheartedly encourage you to go check out. I actually recorded some footage for it a while back, but ended up having to shelve it due to technical issues. But I might end up revisiting it later down the line. The only real thing holding me back, unfortunately, is that much like Disco Elysium, it is a very heavily text-driven game. So anything that I do with it is apt to just turn into a slow-boil, story time with retcon sort of deal. Some people love those, others very much don't. But for now, I'll just point curious parties towards the demo and give it my wholehearted endorsement. I think Beauregard has created an utterly fascinating, anachronistic fantasy world, and I am very much looking forward to getting my hands on the finished game. I'll leave it at that. After that, we've got some slightly more conventional fare. King Arthur, Legion 9, by Neocore Games. And as the name implies, this is the sort of kind of sequel to King Arthur: A Knight's Tale, which is a game I always wanted to touch on in the past, but just never managed to find time for, in large part because the full campaign is something like 70 hours long. But much like its predecessor, Legion 9 is a strategic CRPG with grueling turn-based tactical battles, set in a world inspired by classic Arthurian legend, albeit with a distinct grimdark twist, and in this case, also blended with elements of the ancient Roman Empire. I've said it before, but I am a huge fan of anachronistic fantasy or historical games, so this sort of thing immediately piques my interest just on principle alone. I haven't had a chance to actually try it, but the trailers and screenshots all look pretty promising. I have heard that Legion 9 is a good bit tamer than the first one was, that it simplifies or tones down a lot of the more brutal mechanics of its forebear, that it's shorter as well. But, I mean, it still looks like a pretty solid game. That aside, I'll also note that it looks like it's being sold for less than half the price of the original, so that does make me inherently more forgiving when it comes to things like watered-down mechanics or shorter overall runtime. No demo on this one, but the game actually did hit launch a couple of weeks ago, so I'm a little late to the party on this one. But still, definitely worth a look if you enjoyed the first game. Just be sure to temper your expectations going into it. After that, we've got a distinctly more casual title, but one that I am still really looking forward to wasting some time with. Knights in Tight Spaces, by Ground Shatter and Raw Fury. This is the spiritual sequel/prequel to Fights in Tight Spaces, a separate little card-driven turn-based tactical game that I always kind of wanted to touch on in my videos, but I just never got around to. Like the original game, it looks to be a fantastic blend of striking visuals and tight, well-made card mechanics, though in this case set to a high fantasy backdrop, rather than the modern-era John Wick-inspired theme of the original. Likewise, like the original game, it also doesn't just coast on its card mechanics, but instead makes full use of the square-based tactical battle grid, riddled with environmental elements and far too plentiful foes that the player needs to exploit. It's the sort of game that seems simple at first, where you can just brute force your way through the early challenges with the most basic 1-2 card combos, but as you get deeper, you'll find yourself needing to build more and more intricate multi-part maneuvers as you not only attack your foes, but also evade or misdirect their inevitable counterattacks, preferably into other foes. It's a simple concept turned up to 11, and now with a fun new fantasy flair. The original game still holds up, and the new standalone spin-off looks to add even more fun new mechanics to the mix. Obviously not a game I'd be apt to do a full series on, but it is one that I might at least end up touching on at some point. It does look like a lot of fun. Sadly, no word on exactly when this one is coming out, but there is a demo temporarily available on Steam for those who would like to go check it out. After that, we've got... a particularly intriguing one. New Arc Line by Dream8 and Fulcrum Publishing. This one is a single-player, story-driven CRPG that takes place in an anachronistic steampunk fantasy setting that very, very clearly draws inspiration from both Shadowrun and Arcanum, two properties that I've long had a vested interest in. That said, unfortunately, beyond the broad strokes covered in the various teasers and trailers, we don't really know a lot about this one just yet. There's turn-based tactical combat, but it's hard to really get a feel for it based on the teasers thus far. There are hints of a non-combat skill system for exploration and social interactions, possibly card-driven. The promo material also stresses an Arcanum-style approach to the clash between machinery and magic, with many of the planned classes and subclasses clearly leaning into one or the other. On one side, you've got hellfire-flinging occultists, spiritual voodoo priests, or celestial astronomers. But then on the other end, you've got ray gun-toting mad scientists or diesel punk engineers with big, clunky battle suits. I will say, I am intrigued, but overall it is hard for me to really form an opinion about this one until I know more about the specifics of how everything will actually work and fit together. But what I've seen thus far does look pretty promising. I'm cautiously optimistic on this one, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. For now, however, we move on. The next game on my list here is Skald Against the Black Priory by High North Studios and Raw Fury, which actually hits launch in just a few days. And this one is clearly a retro love letter to the 8-bit CRPGs of yesteryear, with a visual style reminiscent of the 80s and 90s gold box era games that I personally grew up on, but with the major benefit of modern writing and UI design. From a gameplay standpoint, it looks pretty straightforward, with turn-based tactical combat on a standard gold box-style square grid, and a rule system that is similar, but legally distinct from Dungeons & Dragons. The player builds their own character from the ground up, but then populates the rest of their 6-slot party with a motley assortment of quote-unquote broken heroes they encounter on their travels, each with their own pre-established background, personality, and possibly conflicting agendas. This is honestly one of those titles that really kind of kills me, because based on everything I've seen, it looks like it's going to be a very fun and immersive dark fantasy CRPG, but at the same time, the sheer dedication to the retro presentation style does make it a much tougher sell on a primarily visual platform like YouTube. I definitely plan on picking it up and personally playing it. I'm just not sure it's one I'll ever really be able to make any videos about. But then again, who knows? I certainly thought the same about Battle Brothers, and that one definitely ended up surprising me. Next up, we've got what's probably the biggest named title on this particular list. Slay the Spire 2 by Megacrit. While Slay the Spire certainly was not the first roguelike deck builder, I would say it's easily the best known ever since it took Steam by storm back around 2018. It's served as the inspiration for dozens of copycat games in the years since, probably over 100 at this point, some of which I have actually previously touched on in my past videos. Which does make me wonder why I've never actually touched on this one before. That said, it is hard to say if the sequel will be able to meet or surpass the absurdly high bar set by the first, but the teaser material certainly does look promising. The art design is still gorgeous, even better than it was in the original, painting a picture of a dark and evocatively surreal fantasy world. The card combat still seems similar at its core, but with the promise of strange new gimmicks and twists. And while we do see at least some familiar faces, such as the Silent Huntress and Ironclad Warrior, they're also teasing us with the promise of some intriguing new ones, such as the skeletal Necrobinder. I have actually kind of regretted not doing any videos about Slay the Spire in the past. As a roguelike, it's obviously not a title that really lends itself to any sort of long-term, enduring series, but it would have been fantastic for the occasional one-shots or short runs. It is literally a game that's designed to be played in short but satisfying bursts. Slay the Spire 2 isn't slated for release until sometime next year, but maybe I'll actually be inspired to actually do something with it this time around. I mean, goodness knows, I'm almost certainly going to be playing it in my downtime anyway. Which brings us to our next entry. The Dunwich Horror by Atom Brain Games and Bonus Stage Publishing. Those are the same folks who are behind Dreams in the Witch House, another quirky little Lovecraftian game that I have touched on before, most recently in this very video. I don't know what it is, but there's just something about the carefully balanced blend of genres and gameplay mechanics in Dreams in the Witch House that really tickles my brain. The retro point-and-click adventure aesthetic, the surprisingly well-crafted survival mechanics, the almost seamless blending of a mundane theme with elements of inescapable eldritch horror. I mean, there's a reason I keep thinking about going back to revisit it. I had a lot of fun with the demo, even if it did admittedly struggle to gain much traction with my general viewing audience. I am generally curious to see whether Atom Brain Games can actually recapture that lightning in a bottle to match or even exceed the unique balance they hit with that first game. But I would say that the developer has certainly earned some benefit of the doubt. Their first foray into quirky occult adventure ended up being a very pleasant surprise, so I'm certainly happy to see them delving back into it. The game's obviously still very much a work in progress. There's not even a Steam page yet, let alone a speculative release date. But I am still very much looking forward to seeing how it turns out. And, hopefully by then I'll have finally found the time and energy to force the Raiders to watch me play College Freshman Cult Simulator. It's going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. It is inevitable. But I digress. Moving on. Which sadly does bring us to the final entry on my list. A curious little indie title called Don't Kill Them All by Fika Productions? I'll assume I pronounced that right. I'll admit, it's been quite a while since I've seen anything on Kickstarter that really piqued my interest, let alone actually coaxed me into backing it. But that said, at a glance, Don't Kill Them All might just be an exception. I've always loved games that flip classic tropes on their head, fantasy or otherwise. Reverse dungeon, civilized monsters, altruistic villains, slaying princesses, or in this case, environmentally conscious orcs. At its most basic, this is a strategy game with a heavy focus on base building, resource management, and turn-based tactical combat, which is quite a combination considering the central theme. It thrusts the player into the role of a half-elf, half-orc life coach. trying, perhaps fruitlessly, to teach a tribe of savage orcs to live more harmoniously with nature, to essentially turn from their inherently unsustainable pillaging and raiding, and instead focusing on learning how to live off the land, while also protecting themselves from the predations of their more monstrous and murderous neighbors. There's still plenty of combat and carnage to be had, of course. After all, they're just one tribe amidst many, and goodness knows the others aren't ready to give up on pillaging and raiding just yet. But even there, the game's quirky conservationalist theme is still at the forefront, with the tactical combat requiring the player to eliminate foes, while also being wary of inadvertently destroying valuable resources that are scattered around the grid-based battlefield. And, of course, that's assuming you can even get your own orcs to listen to you in the first place. True to form, they're stubborn and impulsive creatures, with each member of the tribe requiring their own delicate touch and careful manipulation to actually nudge towards the desired outcome. If the player's too heavy-handed, the orcs will inevitably rebel, so it's a careful balancing act to try to keep the relationship sustainable. It's a fun and surprisingly well thought out and well presented idea for a very unusual concept, all wrapped up in an absolutely adorable art style. Sadly, it is also a game that won't actually be playable for a very, very long time. The speculative launch date is currently set for September of 2026, but, expect delays. It is a Kickstarter after all. But that said, in the meantime, I am honestly happy to toss a few bucks in the hat to help try to make sure it actually does reach launch. But of course, that's just me. I do tend to latch onto a lot of oddball indie projects that might never find mainstream appeal. But if you find the concept for this one at all intriguing, then I would strongly recommend popping over to their Kickstarter page and at least checking it out. All right, let's hit the pause button real quick. This 15-minute retrospective has run slightly long. Let me grab a drink, clear my throat, and we'll wind this thing down. And hey, kudos to you if you've actually made it this far into the video. I do appreciate it. It is nice to occasionally know that I'm not just talking into the void. And we're back. And yeah, let's go ahead and wrap this up. My goodness, I did not mean to talk for this long. I suppose this is actually the tertiary reason I kind of started leaning away from doing these so often. I do create a framework, like an outline of the things that I want to talk about in these videos, along with bullet points of specific talking points that I go down as I'm otherwise rambling. But my goodness, once I open that spigot and start spilling out all my thoughts, it can be tough to turn it back off, and it just starts flowing into all these tangents, and even once I realize what's happening, it can be tough to turn it back off. And in the meantime, you've got thought juice just getting everywhere, and then you're stuck doing the cleanup afterwards. But, hey, it's been a year. We were probably overdue. Things were a bit backed up. And, again, for those who actually made it this far, thanks. It's weird. You're weird for listening to some rando ramble about nothing for an hour straight. But I still appreciate it. It's nice to feel validated. And I will say, it does feel cathartic to actually talk about some of this stuff. As I've said before, I do have a tendency to get lost in my own head from time to time. So it is good to have an outlet. That used to be my game nights or running events at the local shops, but that all went by the wayside during the pandemic. And now I've just become violently introverted. I suppose I could talk to my cats, but they're cats. I'm not a crazy person. So even I know they've got better things to do with their time. Anyway, back on track. I really do appreciate all your support, both the raiders and the rank and file viewers, even if you got bored or distracted and already clicked away from my ramblings before you reached this point. In which case I do have to wonder how you're hearing me say this, but that's neither here nor there. I've said it before, and I'm sure I'll say it a million more times moving forward, but But obviously, I would not still be creating content if it weren't for folks actually watching and engaging with the content I create. I mean, I'm sure I'd still probably pop up a sporadic video from time to time just as a hobby, but I certainly wouldn't be cranking out 20 plus videos a month. So, in a way, this is really kind of your fault. You did this. Just look at what you've done. You're a monster. And I'm thankful for it. That said, I should stress that it really does make a difference when you actually engage with the videos. Watching them, clicking the things, liking, commenting, subscribing, ringing bells, and any number of the other 40,000 things that YouTube wants me to tell people to do. Honestly, I didn't even realize ringing the bell and subscribing were two different things until like a year ago. I do feel like YouTube might be overcomplicating it all a little bit. There's like 20 things they want me to tell you to do now, but in the meantime, I guess just maybe do the things you're willing to do and know that I appreciate it, because I think every single click counts, except for when they apparently don't, but YouTube won't give me specifics on how all of that works. So, we'll just hope for the best. Hello, Ellie. And then, of course, there's the Raiders, the fine folks who help keep this channel running financially. I mean, what can I even say there? I mentioned I wouldn't keep doing this if it wasn't for the rank and file viewers. But I literally couldn't keep doing this if it wasn't for the Raiders, both on Patreon and on YouTube's weird subscription membership thing. Always super fun having to try to explain the difference between memberships and subscriptions. But yes, while every click counts, the Raiders are the ones who take a step past the digital middlemen and more directly contribute towards my month-to-month overhead. Keeping the lights on, keeping the cats fed, keeping my recording rigs up and running. I'm actually due for an upgrade next year. Still haven't decided how I'm going to handle that, but apparently my current rig isn't Windows 11 compatible, and they're pulling support for 10, so that's fun. But regardless, I do have a bit of a backlog here, over a year's worth actually. And I know the vast majority of the Raiders don't really care if I thank them in these retrospectives, but it's still something I like to do. I am but a voice on the radio, so it does feel like the best way to acknowledge and recognize the contributions of these fine and/or fanatical folks is verbally. So, that said, I'd like to thank all the Raiders who helped keep this channel running back in 2023 and through the first half of 2024. That's a fair few folks. I've got like, 200 names here. So, I am going to go ahead and work down the tier list, building up momentum until I am rattling these off Micro Machine Man style. One sec, just need to prepare my body. Special thanks to the Raider Lords, Dragon Matrix 7, Matthew Smith, and Revenant. The Raider Captains, Aloise, Blind Iron, Croaking LOR, Drakith, Theory V23, Egon Alter, Emil, Excelsior, Gottlieb, James Tremay, Kazorm, Mark Giemza, Nathan Welch Jr., Overlord Ferrum, Random Passerby, Robbie B., Rowan Church, Thomas Piedkowski, Trip Hop and Skip, and Valenrook. The Veteran Raiders, Ben Hollingshead, Blaine Landowski, Bob, Dale Johnson, Dr. Funkenstein, Epic Seymour, Glenn Jensen, Gresham, Ice Storm Shadow, Indiana Smith, Jacob Kalabinski, Jace Orkblood, Jeffrey McInnes, Jeremy Worth, Caspis, Killer Minnow, Lady Shayna, Laura and Mike, Leroy Nukinson, Michael Bain, Nerd Professor, Neurolancer, Nishko, Nod Goblin Nico, Raximus Savage, Scott Brown, Shara, Sean Orpin, Short Trek Hero, Silencer, Stoltz, Terry Williams, The Link King, The Book Thief, Thomas K. Arata, Todd Klein, Valenrook, Varshoon, Vertigo 322s, Harmallins, Lai Waklaw. Ellie, you're in my way. The Honorary Raiders, Adam Coles, Alexander Hawkbaum, Arrow 1 Bowman, Austin Fagan, Benjamin Gray, Bose 77, C1S, Christian, Chronosaur, Comrade Robot, David Pascal, Dupin, Ugo 2, Ethan Vonderweed, Felix Christoph, Flamebeard, Photon 0, Hextoller, ICU Uwu, Itabaw, James Bullock, Kem Jensen, Ellie, Lulalu, Marius Berizinia, Matt Harris, McLeod, Misha, Oil of Hope, Optimal 2, Peter, Porphy's Attorney, Rob H., Robin Berger, Sam Russell, Serve Cold, Sean Smith, Steve Soxa, Timothy LaRose, and Tote Alberg. Oh my god, Ellie. No. The Raiders in Training, Adam Lacko, Amos B, AN, Another Walk, Austin Pence, Bill Colton, Chai T, Christopher McKenney, David Stewart, David Wellman, Dawen Liang, Denton EX, Douglas 9521, Duong Nguyen, Eben Kleinhans, Emma Long, Eric Spiegers, Exciting Burp, Frank Barone, Gil Barath, Christoffel, Heldrahir, Hazim Rashid, Henrik Reimer, Hobotron, John Cotro, Jonathan Chisholm, Kings Rook, Chris Lighthawk, Luke, Manlord, Abosha, Nolan Burke, Oscar Van Vliet, Patricia Murray, Pete NZ, Purge, Rick Queeper, Robert Turner, Rob Batten, Stephanie Taylor, The Ogre King, Tom Grover, Vuk Rules, XD666XD, and Ivrath. Thank you, Ellie. You made that so much easier. I do appreciate your assistance. Yeah, you're a sweetheart. Come here. Not quite the torrent of names I was going for, but you get the idea. Ellie sort of intervened. But yeah, hey, know that she appreciates you too. That said, if you would also like to help support the channel, then, I mean, you know where this is going. Engagement does make a difference. Viewing, watch time, clicking, all the things. And for those of you who want to take it a step further, help keep this whole show running, we have the usual suspects: PayPal, Patreon, YouTube memberships, Nexus GG. Links to all that jazz are in the description down below. And, you know, not for nothing, but membership does come with some minor perks. Obviously, the channel's not huge. I can't really afford anything particularly garish. I mean, heck, I can't even afford custom icons. I looked into them, but your average artist quotes prices in the hundreds to thousands of dollars, which is fair. People should be paid for their work. I just can't fit it in my budget. But the Raiders do get some things, aside from my shout-outs and awkward thanks. They do also get early access to most of my videos, at least the ones I actually managed to finish early. They also get preferential placement on any waiting lists or sign-up sheets I happen to run, Xenonauts 2 being the most recent example, but I have also used Raider-submitted characters in the past for things like Solasta, Lord of Nothing, Varnhold's Lot. Games with deeper recruit pools like Xenonauts, XCOM, Wildermyth, Battle Brothers, those tend to open up to the general audience after a while. The Raiders usually get about a week's head start. But the smaller games, the ones where we only get like 4 to 10 slots, those tend to be Raider exclusive. As do various polls. I mean, obviously I run a quarterly public poll for the general audience, but the Raiders get access to more polls, polls upon polls. Well, a modest assortment of polls. You know, generally speaking, they're the ones who get to decide which companions we use in a game, or the broad strokes of how I build our main characters in some of these more involved CRPGs. Vex Godglove, Auric Alchem, Valen von Valancius, that's mostly their fault. Their votes built the framework or skeletons for those characters. I'm just the one who fleshed them out and gave them a voice. But yeah, generally speaking, the Raiders do get a chance to influence the various series I run, whether it is in helping me decide what to run, or how I run them. Though, you know, as the Retcon Raider, I do get final say, executive override, if you will. The Raiders didn't tell me to kill Camellia, for example. That just really kind of had to happen. But yeah, you get the idea. Membership doth have its privileges, as ephemeral as most of it may be, with none being more ephemeral than my eternal thanks. It's there, all around you. You'll just have to take my word on that. Anyway, we are now pushing the 70-minute mark, so I feel like I've rambled enough. We had our real talk, we chatted about the channel, we gabbed about games, which, you know, is kind of the point of this channel. We got some cat pics, we did our thanks, and we did the obligatory Patreon pitch. Well, Patreon Plus, it's like 7 different things now. But yeah, I think we're just about ready to slap a bow on this thing and call it wrapped. This is Retcon Raider, signing off. Thanks for listening. See ya, Space Cowboy.